Hello Year 7 and welcome to today's lesson. To start off with, I'm going to ask you to do a knowledge retrieval task based on the work we've been doing on the poem By the Sea. Basically, I'd like you to brain dump as much as you can think of about the poem. I want you to think about its context, which is the background information about Emily Dickinson and what life was like for women in America in the 19th century. Any key quotations that you can remember from the poem, for example, the mermaids in the basement. I'd like you to think about the structure of the poem. What can you remember about how it's written? For example, the number of lines in each stanza. What can you remember about the rhyme scheme? Can you remember anything about the rhythm of the poem? And I want you to think about any language devices. Can you think of any metaphors that are used in the poem? Spend about 5 minutes writing as much as you can remember. Don't worry about drawing out the grid if you can't print it out. Just use the headings for lists. Don't worry about writing in full sentences apart from the quotations. You can bullet point your ideas. Just write down as much as you can in 5 minutes. And then when you're ready, move on to the next slide. So here are a few thoughts. In terms of the context, remember the Victorian era, or the Americans wouldn't call it the Victorian era, the 19th century, was patriarchal. Men had power, women were largely excluded. The Industrial Revolution, which had happened late in the previous century and carried on during the 19th century, changed the dynamics of society and led to more women working, which led to women wanting more influence on society. Now, key quotations, you could have chosen any really from the poem. I've included a few. The Mermaids in the Basement Came Out to Look at Me obviously emphasizes the comparative weakness of women compared to men, which remember the frigates on the upper shore. Or the upper level rather. Until we met the solid town, the idea of the town being solid compared to the sea being not solid, and an implication there about the patriarchy. Past my apron, past my belt, and my bodice too. Obviously, the power of the patriarchal society that she can't do anything to stop. But you could have chosen other quotes from the poem. The structure, it's got a partial rhyme scheme, and then the rhyme scheme kind of breaks down later, and it's got that at the end. It's got that half rhyme at the end of that ow, ooh, oh sound. The poem is fragmented by the dashes, that weird punctuation that Emily Dickinson uses, and it's in quatrains, and that's 4-line stanzas, and that could reflect the rigid structures of society. Language devices, you've got juxtaposition, she's a mouse, the men are frigates. You've got the personification of nature, the way the sea is presented as a living thing, a living masculine thing, which is unusual for the sea when you think about it. The sea is usually feminine. Slightly surreal images, the mermaids in the basement, the masculine sea reaching out for the hempen hands, symbols of restriction, the ropes trying to catch her, the idea of the sea trying to eat her up, and in fact the whole extended metaphor of the sea, which goes all the way through the poem, the idea of the sea being this powerful masculine entity. You might have had some more, but those are my ideas. Tick the ones you got right. Now, today we are going to do an analysis of By the Sea. We're going to use all the work we've been doing over the last few lessons to write a PEEA paragraph. And we're doing this to improve our analytical writing skills. So take a quick look at the By the Sea knowledge organizer section just to remind yourself of the poem, the key points, the vocabulary, and so on and so forth. And then when you're ready, move on to the next slide. I ought to say you will find this easier to look at if you're looking at it in your actual copy of the knowledge book rather than on the screen, because I don't want you to strain your eyes. Here is a waggle of an answer to the question. The question is, how is the theme of restriction presented in Dickinson's By the Sea? Now, obviously, if we're in the lesson, I'd ask you to do this yourself. We're not in the lesson, so I've done it for you. You'll see I've highlighted the different key areas. So on the waggle, the point. The theme of restriction is presented in Dickinson's By the Sea through the use of personification. That's my answer to the question. There are others. You could say it's presented by the image of the hempen hands, the rope. You could say it's presented by the image of the woman in her constrictive, restrictive clothing, the bodice, for example. I've gone with personification. My example, this is seen in the poem where the frigates, the metaphors for men, attempt to capture her by extending hempen hands. And that's my example. I'm using those frigates and the extending hempen hands as the quote. And then I explain it. Literally, Dickinson's By the Sea relates to the task of taking a dog for a walk on the beach. That's the literal meaning of the poem. However, Dickinson transforms this simple act into a contemplation of the restrictions placed upon women in the 19th century patriarchal society, and that's the symbolism in the poem. Dickinson personifies the sea as a he, which tries to trap her with his hands of rope. You see, I've used the terminology, personification, and I've reinforced my point about my evidence. Then I analyze, I dig deep. This idea continues through the poem as the sea continuously stalks the speaker, making it appear as though she is trapped and lacks freedom. The repetition of the word "and" lists the various restricting items of clothing that women in the 19th century patriarchal society would be required to wear. So I focused here on the words "and." And I've put a bit of context in. Similarly, the tightly contained quatrains represent the restrictions imposed on women from which they could not break free. And that's the cultural link, that's the context to society. And you can see I've tried to use some of our key vocabulary. You can see that it's very clearly structured. You've got the point in yellow, the evidence in green, the explanation in the light blue, the analysis in grey, and the context in the darker blue. Read over that again, because that's the kind of writing I'd like you to do when you answer the question. Before you write your essay, I just want to give you some advice. Firstly, there is a scaffold on the slide. I'd like to use that to help you plan out your essay. You should spend about 5 minutes doing this. Don't rush straight into it. When you actually write your PEA paragraph, that'll take you about 15 minutes. If you happen to get that done within the 15 minutes, then you could add some more information about the historical context of the poem. But you don't have to do that. The most important thing is you've got your point, evidence, explanation, and analysis. Now, for example, a contextual paragraph might be a Victorian audience will understand the speaker's frustration and her desire to be free. It's because Victorian society, there were many rules and guidelines about how to behave. In particular, women were supposed to obey their fathers and husbands, and so would have empathy with the poem's speaker. Once you've completed your essay, I'd like you to check your work using the checklist, and I'd like you to highlight, like I did in the example, the point, the evidence, the explanation, and the analysis. Right, the question I'd like you to answer: how does Dickinson present the sea as either attractive or frightening? How does Dickinson present the sea as either attractive or frightening? And you can see I've given you a scaffold here. I've given you some sentence starters to help you. I've given you a quotation that you can use. You don't have to use that quotation. You can use any other quotation from the poem. You've got your key vocabulary at the bottom. I'd like you to spend about 20 minutes writing your answer. And when you've written it, I'd like you to use the checklist under the success criteria heading to make sure that you have done everything. I'd like you to make sure that you highlight your point sentence, your evidence, your analysis, your explanation, and the context. That'll take you about 20 minutes. Once you've done that, please move on to the next slide. To finish off, what I'd like you to do is answer one of the questions below. If you want to have a go at both of them, you can do, but I just want to see the answers to one. And these are based on the two other poems that we've looked at, The Kraken and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. if you want to answer about the Kraken, I like to think about the idea of freedom. How does the idea of freedom apply to the Kraken, which was also written in the 19th century? Where do we see evidence of freedom or entrapment in the Kraken? Think about the Kraken, think about its situation, think about its life, and think about its death. What happens when the Kraken is freed? How does the idea of freedom work in the Kraken? Is the Kraken actually free or is it trapped? Alternatively, think about the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. How does the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner warn the reader about the danger of too much freedom? Think about what the mariner does. He does it because he's free to do it. Nobody stops him. He does it because he can, but what are the consequences of what he does to the albatross? What do you think Coleridge is saying about freedom and free will and choosing what to do and the consequences of your actions? I'd like you to pick one of those questions to answer. I'd like you to write me a couple of sentences giving you reasons. When you've completed that, please photograph your work. You should have your knowledge retrieval task. You should have your notes for your PEA paragraph. You should have your completed highlighted paragraph, and you should have your answer to the question about one of the two poems we've studied. When you've done that, when you've photographed your work, please upload it. Please make sure the work's attached. Please make sure you've clicked that you've turned it in, and then that is it.